very vivid memories of the whole Big Thing album, the writing, recording process, all the mixing. It was an interesting time for us, actually, as a band, because it was towards the end of the 80s, I guess 1988, in fact 89 when it came out. And we were looking for a new direction, which is nothing new, because we're always looking for a new direction. But we just which had been quite successful. And that was a very different sound for us. And we knew we couldn't repeat that. And music was changing around us. So dance music was developing, electronic music, particularly rave music. And it was just slightly pre-grunge, I guess. But things were feeling very different. Culture was changing, and the 80s were coming to an end. So the first thing was to search for a direction. The sessions were really broken up into daytime and nighttime in the studio. I think in the daytime, there were more Daniel's sessions, Daniel Abrahams, one of our producers, along with Jonathan Elias. And he leaned a little more towards the rock side of the record, Daniel. He loved the Velvet Underground and gritty guitars, and so we usually ended up getting something during the day, and I would come in later, maybe, 4 or 5 o'clock or something, and see what had happened in the first few hours, and then develop it from there. And inevitably what happened was that I would try and change a lot of it overnight with Jonathan Elias, which was the sort of second half of the sessions. So we were sort of tugging against each other, and John and I were sort of almost at pole ends sometimes, and then we'd meet in the middle on things like All She Wants Is, that we both realized was probably more of the key to the sound of the record.
I've had many different memories recording the album Big Thing. For me, being an American kid who, at the time, I was 30, but I hadn't really traveled that much to Europe. And so, of course, we were recording in Paris for much of the project. Even though initially we did rehearsals at my studio in New York on 17th Street, as far as the recording parts of the record, we would work at the studio that was sort of on the outskirts of Paris. And it was called Studio Davout. And I remember driving there often with John, and then we started taking the tube over there. The studio itself was small, but we had a rehearsal area, so often we'd sit and we'd write, and then we'd jump over into the control room. And it was a fun experience, writing and recording. So I remember that, which was a little different for me at the time. I was used to having all the material together and then recording. But this was another way of doing it.
My memory of the Big Thing sessions is, so the first thing is, I had worked on Notorious with Duran Duran, had done the whole album, and that went great, got along great with the guys, and after that did a bunch of remixes and live recordings, and so then they asked me to get on board for the next project. They decided they wanted to produce themselves and asked me to come along to do the engineering and co-produce with them. We decided to go back to Paris, in the same place, the same studio where we had started to work together on Notorious. the studio, they basically rebuilt a studio basically for this session, which was amazing. They put a new console, they put a lot of new gear. So we came in, it was a brand new studio, which was very nice. And we started basically, the guys wrote in the studio. So one thing I remember is that John and Simon and Nick and I and Jonathan would be in the studio, and they would be working out on ideas. I was playing guitar to help along. Jonathan was playing piano to help along. I was recording all the ideas as they came, and I was also running. I had a Mac and a very primitive sequencer, and I was running sequences at the same time. So I was juggling a few things all at once. And that's how it started.
We were at this little studio in the west of Paris. The studio was, I believe it was called Studio Davou. And I remember Steve Ferroni playing drums. I remember working on the songs, and it was one of those albums where the people who went in the daytime would like record all this stuff in the daytime, and then somebody would come along in the evening after the daytime people had gone, no names mentioned here, and they would change everything, and it was, you know, it was kind of disparate. So there were times when you had two different versions of the songs going. I mean, I remember writing Land. I remember that song. I think that was very good. And I Don't Want Your Love, and all sorts of songs. I mean, you know, it's a good album.
When I think about recording that album, most of the writing was done in Paris, and we'd worked in Paris on Notorious. But then we decided to do like the entire album. We had a lot of Steve Ferroni played on the album a lot. Warren Cucurullo actually, you know, was in the studio with us, as opposed to Notorious, where he'd really just been a sideman. I mean, some of the big sessions that we had. I mean, Drug was like a monster track. Specific memories, it was, you know, it took some doing. You know, it was not easy. It very rarely is, because as with most Duran albums, there's an element of reinvention involved, and it's not just about, you know, let's write 10 songs. You know, it's not about that. It's like, let's write 10 songs and make sure that they sound modern and that the drums are doing something kind of new and cool, and you know, I've got to make sure that my bass playing sounds like, you know, I'm growing, and I think everybody's very conscious that they're doing something, that they're perceived as doing something progressive, and that they're growing. You know, I mean, you always wanted to, as we still do, you know, we always want to be perceived as though we're growing.
Somebody just said to me, and I'm talking in the last 5 minutes, that Duran Duran, the big thing is Duran Duran's first electronics album. That's, which I've never thought of before. I've never heard before, by the way. I'm not sure. I'd have to have a think about that.
One thing I think was clear before we went in the studio to work on this record was that it was going to be different from Notorious. I think the guys wanted to do something different. They wanted to experiment. And as far as I was concerned, I definitely wanted to do something different also sonically. So for Notorious, we had gone to Abbey Road to record this big drums, this big live reverb, natural ambience. And I decided for the next one, I don't want to do that because I did it and I don't want to repeat myself. For the next one, I just want to do something totally different. I want to do something drier, something harder, just, you know, do something different. I think we use also more, machines. John did a lot of drum programming on the Lean drum. We used some sequencing, I think a lot more than on previous records. So I think it was a combination of them trying to do different things, changing the technology a little bit.
Big thing was definitely Duran Duran's first real electronic album. I felt that even back then, because it was a departure for them. And I know it was largely driven by John, that record. And I felt like it really was more of an electronic-driven project in general. And John loved doing a lot of the programming on the drums with Daniel. And they definitely took it into a more electronic aspect, even in the rhythm section. Certainly on synthesizers, Nick and I were very at home with that. And it wasn't until pretty far into the project that I started hearing guitars jangling around.
I would never consider Big Thing as being Duran Duran's first electronic album. Personally, I would say it was Duran Duran, the debut record, which was covered with layered electronics and pulsing sequences, merging with rock guitars and atmospheres. Perhaps why some people perceive it that way is because of the more pure electronic dance that became popular around that period and certainly developed after that period. There are songs like All She Wants Is and I Don't Want Your Love that were firmly in that kind of area.
I don't think of the album as being a particularly electronic album. I guess it was the first time that we all started to experiment programming drums and, bass synths, and like I Don't Want Your Love is an example of that. But I still think most of the album has a very kind of organic feel to it, and whether it's the opening track, Big Thing, or a song like Palomino or Too Late Marlene, or the original version of Drug, there's a lot of instrumentation. I mean, we were really going crazy on that album with horn sections and percussion players and backing vocalists. I mean, we were really laying it on thick. I think that, yes, perhaps there was a sense of, it was probably the first album where we were kind of thinking, what can we do? And there wasn't sort of, the previous album had been marked by the departure of Andy and Roger, and what do we replace them with? Whereas this one was like, okay, well, we know who we are. It's Nick, Simon, and John, and what can we do? And, we were living in Paris. It was a very kind of fertile time for us in a way. We were very, very music driven. We were very kind of motivated to come up with something interesting and kind of bold, I suppose, because of what had happened to us when we put Notorious out. Going out on tour behind Notorious had been kind of a weird, like, come to Jesus. It was like, oh, okay, so we're not the pop stars that we were, a couple of years ago, and sort of accepting that. But then, looking at it as a great adventure and seeing just what it was we could do.
Before I started working with Duran Duran, I had a very small preconception of what it would be like. Since I had worked with John on and off before, we already had a working relationship that was really sweet. And I had not really worked with Simon or Nick, so I didn't really know what to expect. The first situations to really work with them were in rehearsals in New York. And that was a lot of fun because everyone was very open to each other at that time. And everyone came in with a couple of ideas. And then we started sussing it out in rehearsals. Once we were in Paris, everyone spent time with different people, so I started having a good musical relationship with Nick. And then I started working with Simon, and I really appreciated Simon's melodic capabilities. And I had always had one with John. So it shifted around the relationship. So it was very interesting.
So when I first started to work with Duran Duran on the Notorious, I really did not know what to expect. In France especially, they were considered like a quote-unquote, boys band or and I really did not know what to expect, and I was really, really surprised. They were huge stars. They were the Beatles or something. And when I first met them, I was really surprised to find that they were incredibly nice. They were super nice to me. They were super supportive. They were really, I love working with them because they were really easy to work with. We really got along. It was great. Also, they were always ready to experiment and try things. Like no idea were too crazy. They were game to try anything. So for someone like me, for an engineer, it's fantastic. It's like you can do whatever you want, and they're ready to try it.
There are black sheep that sort of wander off into the field and sit all on their own, sulking under a cloud. And those are usually my favorites. Palomino was one of those on the record, I think. It was quite well liked by everyone, but it was one of those tracks that was sort of out there on its own, and it didn't necessarily fit as well with the mood of a lot of the other things. And then I think when I spent one very long evening, I decided the middle should be a slightly jazzy interpretation of my vision of what the sound would have been like when the camera went inside the ear that they find in the grass in David Lynch's Blue Velvet. And on that day, I thought, when I told everyone that maybe we were going to lose that track, so I had to sort of make that middle sound really unusual, and I think it did. But that was the picture that was inside my head. But it made it, and I'm very glad it did, and we played that on tour too. There's always a lot of back and forth with the tracks. Drug, It's a State of Mind. That's one that went through a lot of different iterations, and actually I feel that Simon and I made the wrong decision about the version that was on the album when it came out, and John made the right decision, but he was outvoted by us. So it can certainly happen in our bizarre democracy, but I really did think only months later that John had been right. He wanted to keep the original version that was more in the style of the rest of the album, and Simon and I had gravitated more towards a remix that we'd had done that felt very much of the moment, and it was more exciting to us and more tuned in to what was going on, but still worked very well with what we had. And that's what initially went on the first release. But then when we repressed the album, John and I had talked about it, and we restored it to the original version, which he felt should have been on the record, and which I later agreed.
Actually, I remember there was a point where it was decided that we would put the remix, there was a remix made of Drug. I guess there was a feeling that it could have been a single. So we did a remix with some like trendy, remixer of the moment, and I was outvoted that the remix would go on the album, and I was furious. I remember being in the garden at my parents' house, and I was ready to leave the band over it. I was so upset. We'd invested so much time in the original recording, and I was actually very proud of the original recording. Always felt the album was kind of incomplete, and I was always saying to people, well, actually, there's a much better version of that song, and it makes more sense within the context of the album. But, you can't win them all. And, I was very happy when the original version of the song was restored to the album. I guess it's what film directors feel like when finally there's, on DVD, they get the director's cut gets released. It felt like, it felt good.
It was a really weird, album to finish. Really weird album to finish. And difficult in a way. It seemed to sort of almost be grinding to a halt, I think. And it was quite painful to finish, to actually go. I think I even remember not finishing it in France, but having to come to New York to do some finalized backing vocals and things, or maybe it was London.
As a producer on the record, there were a couple projects that I felt like we were so close and we just couldn't grasp it. One was All She Wants Is. We couldn't really finish it. We kept getting so close and we were frustrated because it was just a matter of a chord or two that we were looking for and the shape of the song. We always had a good groove and an idea on it, and it was really pretty together except for this little part of the form. The other song was, Edge of America. It went through so many transformations. At one point it was just an acoustic song, and then it became a rock song, and then it had so many transformations that it was kind of fun. I'm sure each of us would have a version that we might have preferred, but I think in the end it was an amalgam of a lot of people's feelings.
So one song I really have very specific memories is I Don't Want Your Love. I Don't Want Your Love. The first thing that happened was John and I were in the control room. John was working on the basic groove. He would basically play the drum pattern on the lead drum. And I was running my little sequencer on the Mac. I had a little Mac Plus. I was running the MIDI sequencing, and I made a mistake. I plugged in the out into the wrong module, and so the output of the drum machine started to play into a bass module, which was a complete accident, and it came out like this really cool sounding rumbling bass line, and John and I just looked at each other like, this is cool. And so we kept it, and that became kind of the bed of the song, if you want, which was a complete accident, but I still remember it happening, and I remember John looking at me looking at him, and it was like a great accident. The other thing I remember about the song, one day Simon came in and said, hey, can you put up this song? I want to try something. And so he starts to sing, and the first take he does is like, okay, that sounds interesting. Then he said, give me a second track. So I thought he wants to do it again, but instead he started to put a harmony on top. And I said, that sounds like an interesting harmony. And he said, give me another track. And he started to put a second harmony on top. And I was like, that sounds really different, like a bit strange. And then he put a third harmony. And as it went, it was like, where is this going? And suddenly when he put the last, I think there were 4 harmonies, if I remember correctly. And once he put the last harmony, it sounded brilliant. And I never understood how he did it. because each track separately sounded to me like, not an obvious harmony. And I don't know how he worked it out, if he worked it out before, if he just heard it in his head, but he ended up with this complete, when it was done, it sounded like complete finished.
Now, I love playing I Don't Want Your Love live, but I don't think I'd want to play Big Thing live. Songs like Shame, I think would hold up live. Most albums are like that. Albums that are over 10 years old, there's maybe 2 or 3 songs that you really want to, you could hear any time. It's a classic Duran album. I mean, it's a bunch of guys in transition, and most Duran albums, especially like the post-Andy albums, have that. There's always this sense of transition, and occasionally the chemistry just falls into place, and it might just fall into place for like a couple of minutes, and then it kind of like, and then there's like a different chemistry that doesn't quite work, but you always, it's quite challenging. I guess it's been quite challenging to be a Duran fan in the sort of like post-Andy years, because you really don't ever know what you're going to get, and you kind of have to, it takes you a little while to come to terms with the new sound. It's Big Thing sounds so different to Notorious.
Oh, and so I should talk about Do You Believe in Shame? And there was, we had this song, and I had an idea in my head about a dear friend of mine, Dave Miles, who died from a drug overdose in 1985. And I made a little promise to Dave inside my head that if he could be around, that I would always have him there, and that he could have a little bit of me to live in, and that's really what the song is all about. It came back to haunt me, and I had to write the I've Got to Be Free of You song in Ordinary World many years later. But that's how it went.
Really like Do You Believe in Shame? And the lyric in it has caught me over the years. Simon's loss of a friend, and because I've certainly lost my share of friends over the years, and I have to say that sometimes I end up thinking of that song when I end up losing a friend.
Do You Believe in Shame? Which was written, the lyric was written by Simon about his friend Dave Miles that died far too young, and it really had a profound effect on Simon. And I'm a firm believer that if you can transfer your inner feelings into a lyric, that's usually when you get something that is as good as you're ever going to find. And it's truly heartfelt and dark, but with a little bit of hope. And the video for that was also quite unusual. It was done by an incredible Japanese film director called Chen Kaiga, who I discovered through seeing one of his early films, The Yellow Earth, film in Chinese. I completely fell in love with the color tone palette that he used and the poetry of his work, and had no idea how to find him, but we did find him, and he very graciously agreed to direct the film of the video Do You Believe in Shame, which we shot mostly in New York. Most noted for the scene of the dominoes, which I can't tell you how tempted I was when they'd finally set them all up after hours and hours to just touch one in the middle before we needed to film. But I didn't anyway.
I guess there are some prominent numbers on it for me personally. I think the most important song for me would be, I Don't Want Your Love turned into an amazing song. Now that I remember, I was really struggling for words. I was living in this little apartment in northern Paris, actually, called, it's quite near, sort of near the Étoile. But it was off Rue des Malesherbes, which means bad herbs or bad smells. And it's called Rue de Mérimée. And we had this little house, and John was at the top, I was underneath, and it had like a underneath the floor kind of space. Very weird it was. And I remember going out and walking around this park and writing the words. Yeah. It was a tough one to write, but it kind of came out okay, I think. So yes, I Don't Want Your Love. That stands out. Land. To me, that stands out. That's a really important one for me.
The standout tracks for me are actually probably the singles. It's I Don't Want Your Love. We've been playing live for the last couple of years. We hadn't played it for a long time. And I have to say, it's really been great fun on stage. It's got such a fantastic energy to it. And it hasn't, some songs do date for a while, then they seem to drift back into style. That one for me really has stayed the same as it was, and we haven't done a terribly different arrangement of it, apart from extended the end a bit maybe, and it really holds up and has been going down incredibly well with the audience. So that certainly stands out. All She Wants is one of the best videos we ever made, directed by the extraordinary Dean Chamberlain. It was done a frame at a time, so it took an awfully long time, hence we had dummies made of us for the video. I remember they arrived once after the video. Jane Potter, the lady that used to run our office, nearly had a heart attack because she opened a box that had arrived in the post, and it was one of our heads from the dummies from the All She Wants Is video. Never quite known what's happened to them since. They must be roaming around the world somewhere. But I think that the concept of that and the sound and the sort of structural engineering of the soundscape mingled in with the video made it the most unusual thing on the record. One final track, I suppose, should be mentioned in the light of the world that we live in now is The Edge of America, which was really written about Lakeshore Drive and Chicago, that concrete beach. The first time we'd really stayed there a few years ago and looked at it, and it felt very odd seeing that lake. And I suppose it was about the Midwest of America and about what was going on and what the people were having to endure and the politics of the time too. And rather sadly, I think it is even more prescient today than it was 30 years ago when we wrote it. And I hadn't heard it for many, many years until somebody actually sent something to, I think it was through one of our social media sites, mentioning the song. And I thought, maybe that would be interesting to put into the show. And I was quite taken aback when I listened to it, thinking how little had actually changed, and in fact, in many ways, had become rather more exacerbated. But I like the lyric, and I think it represents how angry a lot of people are, and many with reason to be, over different issues. So yeah, that one stands out, and it goes into the piece that we called Lakeshore Driving. I suppose it's some kind of hint of what the first piece was about.
Well, the songs that stand out to me, I suppose, thinking about the album as a whole, I mean, I Don't Want Your Love, obviously. You know, that was a new style pop song, so we say, for Duran. It was our first kind of like post-Madonna, you know, like pop hit. And it had that kind of like vaguely kind of house-driven sound. That was an important song to get right. I mean, All She Wants Is never entirely succeeded, but it was a valiant effort at some kind of, how can I say, we were kind of going for a kind of nihilistic kind of techno sound, sort of a trance kind of thing. You know, it was like a glimpse of the future, but we were kind of being held back to some degree by kind of old ideas of what a song should be. I think Do You Believe in Shame was a really important song. I think in Simon's development as a songwriter, I remember when Simon came to us and said, "Look, I think I want to write a song about my friend who's just died, and I really feel like I want to memorialize him." And that was like a new idea for us, to bring that kind of thinking to our music. And The Edge of America, the drum, the second part of that song, which was built around, I remember Steve Ferroni showing me it was the groove to the Payback from James Brown, and showing us how that worked, and then building all those percussive elements on top of that, and making this kind of monstrous Afrobeat kind of thing, and then starting to get a sense, wait a minute, if we play these cards right, we can the whole album is, the album becomes like more than just a collection of songs. It becomes like an opera of sorts. It becomes like a concept, and it started to feel that like we could string these things together and make some kind of a statement. And to what degree, it works is down to everyone's preferences. But I do think that it did kind of hang together in a way, and it was definitely a statement. It was more than just a collection of songs. Whatever you think of that is to your taste, of course. But I was quite proud of it. By the time we got it finished.
I think Big Thing has stood the test of time in a lot of respects, because I think some of the things that were happening then were first happening 10 years later. So I think that it's really stood up the test of time, between the electronic drums and the simple live drumming that was added. For some reason, if someone would have asked me today, I would have said 20 years.
Where does it fit in with Duran Duran? I think when you look at Duran Duran's career, there are some landmark records. Obviously, the first album. Obviously, Rio. Those are two massive, important albums for us. Seven and Ragged Tiger was like our difficult third album. But then after that we had Notorious. Now Notorious is a landmark album, because it was the beginning of our relationship. It marked a serious deepening of the relationship with Nile Rodgers, and a much more funky version of Duran Duran. The Big Thing was really the follow-up to that. It's not a momentous album, really. Not in the same way. The next momentous one would be the Wedding album. I think Big Thing, it was an important album for us to make. We had to it was one of those ones we just had to keep going. But in the great scheme of Duran Duran stuff, it's got some great songs on it, but it doesn't have the same kind of cohesion that, say, the Wedding album had, or Paper Gods.
Well, I would probably put it sort of around, on equal footing with Paper Gods. In that it's conceptually it's quite strong. And you can hear that the band are trying to do something. That you can hear the ambition in it. In terms of its succeeding, it's sort of 50-50. But there's something bold about it, and it definitely feels like art, as opposed to just another album. And I think that's something that, at least Duran can do. We always try to write the best. We always try to have our albums like the best sequence of songs that we can write. But like on top of that, or in lieu of that, we try to frame the songs in a way that makes the album seem like an artistic statement.
I never feel comfortable talking about our material and how it's holding up or has stood the test of time. Of course, I have opinions about it. I think I said earlier that I Don't Want Your Love seems to have stood up well to me because we've been playing it live. That's particularly more easy for me to zero in because I see the reaction with the audience. But when you make a record, I can say with all honesty that every record we've ever made, when we released it, it was the best we could make it at that point. It's easy to look in hindsight and say, well, I would have done that differently. Or as I did with the track Drugs, say, we should have used the original version, not the remix on the album that went out. But you have to stand by what you do, and you have to really believe in it. And certainly, Duran Duran may have been accused of many things. One thing that I think it would be quite difficult to accuse us of is not standing by our work and believing in what we've done. And the Big Thing album was quite difficult because it came in a period where we just had a seismic change to the Notorious record. But we certainly couldn't repeat it again. So how do you move to another new direction that is going to be equally as inspiring, but very different? I don't know that it's ever been the most popular Duran Duran album with the fans or the public, but there are some key tracks on it. And I think for us it was a real learning curve that probably was one of the first steps towards the Wedding album, even though we had a slightly more ill-conceived liberty in between. Probably Big Thing was the album that should have preceded the Wedding album, had we had enough focus to be able to do that at that time. These are the elements, really the building blocks, the DNA that was used to form the Wedding album. Of course, I'm proud of it for those reasons. We used a fabulous Dutch graphic designer called Hans Arnold to do the cover, and it feels so Dutch to me, in the greatest tradition of Dutch graphic design, of which I'm a big fan. And so I've always liked the cover. I thank our manager, Peter Rudge, at the time, for coming up with the most banal but rather wonderful idea of saying, well, the record's called Big Thing. Why don't we make the biggest record that anyone has ever made? And so I remember seeing it nailed up above, I don't know, I think it was HMV or Tower Records on Oxford Street, when we used to have many of those wonderful record stores in London. And there it was, the biggest record in the world that he had managed to have made. Of course, it wasn't made of vinyl, so it was a little bit of a cheat. But it was this giant, giant record, and it was used as the display above the record store. So for all of those reasons, I remember Big Thing very fondly.